Yeah, well, before
when the first
we didn't know because well, he was also telling me his reactions. He had not been exposed.
Well, who's the new director of the Washington Center?
Latest I've heard 48 hours ago. Still talking to people.
Friday way.
I remember watching
I'm sure we're going to say complete, I am positive we'll say completely different things. Right?
I know more about one case than I know about
You probably know a little bit about at least two people. A lot about one case.
Washington connection is mostly baseball. Montreal to Washington. But one of the arguments, this whole mess, from my perspective, is that now the Washington have a better chance of succeeding in Washington because the city has changed so much. With your argument, I read it in the paper. There you go. The city has changed so much in the last 30 years. Let's see if indeed it has an impact on baseball.
Certainly, the Sonic players are much more comfortable here today than they were 30 years ago. Would have been 30 words or
Change. We would have never known.
14-year-old star.
Right.
In the contrast between how they're talking about this state, now that they're going out, they have everything doing that, cultivate, they're doing it the right way. Blackmail approach to Major League Baseball. Yeah, let's see.
That's just like church or synagogue, everybody wants to be
Even when people are standing, we
have a staff meeting, they might think, human nature.
yeah, but beware of the person who wants to be in the front row. That's
Well, that's true. Don't do that. Come on up. I just was remarking a minute ago, or Audrey was, that everybody was sitting in the back. This is not church. It's not a synagogue. There is room up front. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm Mike Van Dusen, the Deputy Director, and I'm delighted to chair this session, which is co-hosted by 4 of the 22 units of the Woodrow Wilson Center: the Kennan Institute, the Division of U.S. Studies, the Comparative Urban Studies Project, and the Canada Institute. For me, this event is a celebration. Many of you know Blair Rubel as director of the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies, here for over 15 years, or as director of our important Comparative Urban Studies Project. Many of you also know Blair as a prolific writer and scholar. I guess the author of 5 solo books and about a dozen edited volumes. He has had a remarkable career since leaving New York City for undergraduate years at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and his doctorate work at the University of Toronto. For us at the Woodrow Wilson Center, we take enormous pride in Blair's scholarship, leadership, and collegiality. Blair has brought great respect to this institution, and we are deeply appreciative of what he does for the Woodrow Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is especially mindful of the deep reservoir of respect he has brought to this institution overseas because of his work in and on Russia and Ukraine. The book that is under discussion today is entitled Creating Diversity Capital: Transnational Migrants in Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv, co-published by the Wilson Center Press, and the director of our press is here, Joe Brindley, and Johns Hopkins University Press. I noted at the beginning of the book the reference to Galina Starovotova. It was in November 1998, I believe, that she was gunned down in St. Petersburg. That was just on the eve of my coming to this institution as a deputy director. Galina had been a scholar in residence at the Woodrow Wilson Center several years earlier, and I think that Blair feels that her work on ethnic groups in a Soviet city were one of the inspirations that led eventually to this book. Blair's book grapples with the question: how do urban communities cope with the massive transnational migrations which have occurred over the last several decades? Or put another way, what happens to a city's capacity for urban social sustainability, termed diversity capital, with such influxes? Blair examines 3 cities that have received large numbers of new immigrants and have long histories of divisions into 2 communities of language and race. He tracks how the new immigrants go to school, live, interact, and work, and describes the effects of new demographics on the politics of the cities. Especially for the portions on Kyiv, Blair presents new information that came from a series of surveys the Kennan Institute conducted in 2001 and 2002. Nancy Pompson, a former staffer of the Kennan Institute, and Yaroslav Polinsky, who runs the Kyiv office for the Kennan Institute, participated in that work and helped Blair in the process, I believe. We're also delighted to have today 2 commentators, and we are appreciative of the time they have taken to be with us. Audrey Singer is Immigration Fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program. Audrey has a PhD in Sociology from the University of Texas at Austin, and worked in the Department of Labor, Georgetown University, and Carnegie's International Migration Policy Program before joining Brookings. She is the author of 2 books. Audrey specializes in demography, international migration, immigration policy, and urban and metropolitan change. Dominique Arel joins us from Ottawa, Canada. I guess he voted on Monday and then left town.
Pretty much.
Dominique is associate professor in the School of Political Science and chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Ottawa. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. and is affiliated with the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University for 7 years. He is now in the throes of completing a collaborative manuscript on identity politics of the 2002 Russian census, and he is co-author of a book entitled Census and Identity, The Politics of Race, Ethnicity, and Language in National Censuses, published in 2002. He has written extensively on language politics in Ukraine. Since 2004, he has served as president of the Association for the Study of Nationalities. Audrey and Dominique, welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Blair will speak for about half an hour, and then Audrey and Dominique will make their comments. At 5:30, we will move into the Daniel Patrick Moynihan boardroom across the hall for a reception, and Blair's book will be on sale there. And lastly, I just want to say to Sally Rubel, you're not long-suffering. We're very happy to have you here today. Thank you. Blair.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the kind words, but I especially want to thank you and Lee for creating an environment in which I was able to write this book and other books. I think a number of the program directors here very much appreciate the way in which you encourage us to continue our scholarship, even as we are bureaucrats as well. This is a book that is intended to provoke. It's intended to get people to think differently than they would otherwise think about transnational migrants and about cities. And it argues against what I see to be as three increasingly popular ideas. The first idea that is increasingly popular is that cities represent a form of social organization that is past. The second is that migrants overwhelm a society or a city. And the third is really more of a specialist view than a popular view, but I find it predominantly in academic writing in which immigrants and migrants become the object that are acted upon. They're assimilated, they're isolated, but they are the objects rather than the actors. I try to argue in this book in response that cities are still viable social organizations, although we in the United States need to recalibrate what we consider the city to embrace metropolitan regions. I also argue that migrants can benefit cities by bringing not only new energy, but new perspectives on local life, and that migrants change the pre-existing power relationships. They are agents of change and not only objects who are acted upon. Before I say a little bit about the substance of the book, let me tell how the book came about, because it's unusual. One wouldn't think of these three cities being together. And the book is a product of social science serendipity, and I think it is an example of how we can't totally pre-program our academic careers. Mike already mentioned Nancy Popson, and Nancy and I were in Kyiv in 1998 working with Yaroslav Polinsky to set up the Kennan Institute's office there. And those of you who know Nancy know that she did research on how history was taught in local elementary schools in Kyiv. And one day she came back to the office and she was excited. And she said, "Blair, I don't understand what I just saw, but I was out at school 247 in Tryashina, and I walk in a classroom, and there are kids from Angola, from Afghanistan, from Mongolia. I don't understand what's going on." And from that moment, Nancy began asking questions of school directors. We began asking a number of questions, and it led to the project that Mike described. We worked with several Ukrainian colleagues and conducted 4 sets of different kinds of interviews in Kyiv in 2000, 2001. We interviewed transnational migrants, we interviewed native residents of Kyiv, government officials, and it produced a couple of books. The first was a Ukrainian language book, Non-Traditional Migrants in Kyiv, that came out in 2003. And the second is an English language summary, which is on the Comparative Urban Studies webpage on the Wilson Center website, Non-Traditional Immigrants in Kyiv. So that was a very productive collaboration. But as I was working with Nancy and with our Ukrainian colleagues, I began to realize that one of the reasons why we were surprised is that we think of Kyiv as a post-Soviet city. Post-Soviet cities wouldn't have immigrants. And what I began to understand is the real challenge is to talk about Kyiv not as a post-Soviet city, but just as a city that is like other cities in other places around the world. And in part, the purpose of this book is to try to treat Kyiv as if it's just another city and not a product of the Soviet Union. So with that background, let me try to say a few words about the basic argument in the book. I begin the story at the outset in a different place from where I end up, because I begin by looking at New York and Amsterdam very briefly. But what I try to show is that New York and its parent, Amsterdam, were predicated on the tumbling together of diverse populations for private gain. They were marked almost from birth by high levels of a characteristic that Richard Stren of the University of Toronto and Mario Palese of the University of Quebec at Montreal call urban social sustainability. For Stren and Palese, urban social sustainability consists of policies and institutions that have the overall effect of integrating diverse groups and cultural practices in a just and equitable fashion. An urban meeting place such as in New York or in Amsterdam has demonstrated a high capacity to accommodate diversity for decades, even centuries. Their histories are not seamless. Stren and Palese's goal and standard of just and equitable often represents a standard beyond the grasp of local residents, even in a New York or in Amsterdam. But on balance, they've proven themselves to be organic venues for the accommodation of difference. In comparison to so many other cities in the world, they're communities with deep-seated capacities for absorbing diversity. Cities, in other words, with what might be considered to be high stocks of diversity capital. Beyond asserting these propositions, what I do is I say that diversity capital becomes a shorthand notion for the capacity of a city to sustain diverse, parallel, and conflicting communities in a relatively peaceful and equitable manner. If fully operationalized, it would become a means for measuring what Stren and Palese identify as urban social sustainability. Moreover, in my mind, as with other, why I use the term capital in part, is that the capacity of a city to absorb and accommodate difference can expand and contract. Cities can build up a store of diversity capital and they can expend it, depending on national policies, local policies, economics, and social conditions. So with that in mind, I then turn to Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv, because I argue that these are three cities which have demonstrably increased their diversity capital over the past 30 to 40 years. They've increased their diversity capital in that they have enhanced their repertoire of social, political, and cultural responses to diversity. They have increased diversity capital. Looking back to the 1960s, Montreal and Washington in particular were deeply fragmented cities. There were cities that were defined in binary terms in many people's minds, between French and English and black and white. These divisions led to an intense warlike politics and civic disturbances. Both cities were briefly occupied by federal armies. Perceptive observers at the time could imagine Montreal and Washington becoming Belfast and Johannesburg. Instead, the 21st century reality of both cities is more complex, more diverse, more inclusive than either the Montreal and Washington of 40 years ago or Belfast and Johannesburg today. Now, before I continue, I want to make an important disclaimer. When I make a statement like that, people say, but, and the but is always followed by the fact that there are problems in Washington and Montreal and Kyiv. I don't view these three cities as urban Edens. The reality of history, linguistically and religiously charged history in Montreal and Kyiv, and racially charged history in Washington can't be ignored. The arrival of tens of thousands of transnational migrants who don't share that past don't erase the history, but they create new opportunities to move beyond it. And what I argue in the book is that indeed we can see that something has changed in these three cities. And I set out to look for clues for how these cities have expanded their repertoire of diversity capital, their ability to respond to diversity. And there are several answers. One is what we have come to call in shorthand globalization. The communal-based populism that so dominated Montreal and Washington politics a generation or two ago is giving way grudgingly, but is giving way to a pragmatism that is imposed on Montreal and Washington by a world in which cities compete for international finance and bond ratings. Both cities have been transformed into sprawling metropolitan regions in which the old boundaries don't matter anymore. And one of the themes of the book is that suburbanization and metropolitan growth is part of the story to how all three cities, in fact, have increased their diversity capital. Suburban Montreal and Washington are home to wealthy Francophones and African Americans in a way that wasn't possible 40 years ago. But there's a dark side. Poverty is becoming increasingly concentrated in the inner city, in both cities. And this begins to suggest that rather than just language and race, class is becoming a factor in the life of both of these metropolitan regions in a way in which it had been transcended by other divisions in the past. Third, and I think most crucially, Montreal and Washington have become home to thousands of residents for whom the historic divisions of language and race are meaningless. I speak here of transnational migrants who arrived well after all the nasty battles of the 60s and 70s and even 80s and 90s. And for these newly arriving residents, the old allegiances don't have meaning. And indeed, what they do is they force local politics and, as importantly, local public administration to become rooted in problem solving rather than in some of the ideological battles of the past. A fourth area that's connected to all three of these is that the nature of cross-group contact has changed. In thinking about Montreal and Washington, I began to be dissatisfied by the older literature about language and race, and I began to think that it comes up short. Not because it wasn't serious scholarship, but because we live our lives differently now than we did in the past. We live in cyberspace and we live in automobiles. And what this means is that the central arena for group and individual contact becomes the workplace and the school, rather than the neighborhood and the home. So residential patterns at a macro level may remain segregated, and you can see it clearly in the Washington metropolitan area. But the experience of living in the Washington metropolitan area is much more diverse because of the contacts we have at school and at the workplace. Make no mistake about it, these changes didn't come about because of the magic of the market. These are changes that have not been voluntary, and they have not always been welcomed and embraced. Law 101 coerced immigrants in Montreal to send their kids to French language schools. A whole series of legislative changes and court decisions undermined racial segregation in Washington. Occupational segregation, educational segregation, and residential segregation. So what happened is that the institutional structures and rewards of urban life changed. In my previous book, Second Metropolis, I argued on the basis of the experiences of Chicago, Moscow, and Osaka a century ago that there would be no democratic governance if Democrats were necessary for the emergence of democracy. Rather, the broad institutional rules of the game must be structured in such a way as to reward the pragmatic embrace of pluralism in order for democracy to emerge. Those rules and modes of behavior need to become embedded in local institutions for democratic municipal government to take root. In other words, non-democrats need to see that by acting pragmatically in a democratic manner, they advance their own interests. The spirit of my argument about Montreal and Washington today is similar. If tolerant people are necessary for a city to be inclusive, there will be no inclusive cities. Rather, the structure of the game of urban life writ large must encourage tolerant behavior among the intolerant. And I think we see that in Law 101, and we see it in the desegregation legal cases in Washington. Now, I believe that the most compelling case I have to make is made about Montreal. I think there the evolution is most visible. One no longer speaks of Montreal as if it is Belfast in the making. Instead, all the rhetoric about Montreal is that it has become a cosmopolitan city rooted in a francophonic culture. Difference is celebrated even if lives are lived separately. The case for Washington is not as strong, but I argue that we can begin to think about Washington in a new way, one that isn't predicated on race alone. We can imagine, for the first time in the city's history, a diverse cosmopolitan Washington. This was really unthinkable not too long ago. And to be blunt, I don't think that Washingtonians who fought the battles over home rule and desegregation were necessarily been able to live through this change. It took the presence of people for whom those battles didn't matter in order to change the chemistry of the region. Now, in making this argument, I want to be very careful. Diversity doesn't in and of itself bring about the kinds of social landscapes of equity and inclusion I'm talking about. Simply having thousands of immigrants arrive in Washington doesn't change the deep sociological and spatial divisions of race in Washington. What has to happen is that those divisions and the lives of immigrants need to become intertwined in a way that complements and recognizes the historic African American achievement in Washington, D.C. So for me, Washington is a middle case, a case in which one can see the opportunities for the creation of the diversity capital, but one can also see the possibilities of failure. The situation in Kyiv is much more hidden and complex. One of the reasons why it's more hidden is we knew so little about the city during the Soviet period. Also, Kyiv has had a far more horrific and tragic history than either Moscow or Washington. Kyiv, in fact, is close to the 20th century heart of darkness. Pogroms and revolution a century ago gave way to war, occupation, revolution a few years later. The city witnessed some of the worst atrocities of Stalinist repression and the Holocaust, and much of the city was destroyed in World War II. As a result of all of this turmoil, the ancient Ukrainian capital is, in fact, a much more demographically recent city than either Montreal or Washington. Put differently, you would have an easier time walking out of this building and finding someone whose ancestors live in Washington, D.C. a century ago, or doing the same thing in Montreal than you would finding somebody in Kyiv whose ancestor lived in Kyiv a century ago. Kyiv's linguistic and religious divisions may date back centuries, but the people who are living them are new to Kyiv. And one of the many significant consequences of this disjuncture is that the sort of physical demarcations that you find in Montreal, St. Lawrence Boulevard, or in Washington, Rock Creek Park, don't exist in Kyiv. But the contradictions exist nonetheless. They exist within Kyiv residents. And I think part of what we saw in November 2004 and what became known as the Orange Revolution exposed many of the divisions that still exist in Kyiv. History makes Kyiv a much less stable and fully formed urban community than Montreal or Washington. It's one in which, at the same time, there's far too much history and far too few people who have actually lived it. So the need for diversity capital in Kyiv is particularly acute. And we'll have to see if Kyiv is able to create it in the way in which Montreal certainly has and Washington arguably has as well. Now, in the book, I go on and I go through some case studies, but you can buy the book. It's for sale outside. I want to continue and begin to move to a close by telling really four life stories as a way of communicating something about the feel of the processes I'm talking about. Let me turn first to Kyiv. And I mentioned we did a number of interviews, we did a number of life stories, and I want to tell the story of an immigrant, we'll call him Mahmoud. Mahmoud and his family fled Afghanistan in 1993 when he was in his early 30s. The family arrived in Ukraine after having traveled for most of the year through Pakistan and Kazakhstan. He intended to make his family's way into Europe, and he never expected to remain in Ukraine for over a decade. Mahmoud, his family and daughter eventually received official refugee status in Ukraine after paying $450 in bribes in 1998. His family secured an apartment near the robust Tryeshina market, added a second daughter, and began to build a new life in Kyiv. By 2001, he would tell us that he had so much to protect that he had bought an iron door and bars to protect his apartment and this new life he was creating for himself in Ukraine. Mahmoud and his family have rarely received help from Ukrainian authorities and only marginal assistance from international refugee organizations. They've built their lives on their own. Both daughters attend Ukrainian language schools. Mahmoud and his wife periodically participate in parent-teacher association meetings. He participates in Afghan community organizations and he prays daily at a local mosque. He can communicate in spoken Russian and Ukrainian, but he claims not to be able to write either language. But most importantly, he provides a level of life for his family at Kyiv that he could never have provided in Afghanistan or Kazakhstan. So many Mahmouds have moved to Ukraine that since 2003, applications to obtain Ukrainian citizenship have equaled or exceeded the number of native-born Ukrainians who are leaving the country. By their quiet achievements, Mahmoud, his family, and thousands like them are establishing a middle ground in a country that has been long bifurcated by deep divisions. They provide evidence that perhaps Kyiv has a capacity to create diversity capital. Turning now to Montreal, Montrealers like to brag that their St. Patrick's Day parade is the oldest. It predates New York, and even though narcissistic New Yorkers think they're the only people who have a parade that matters, in fact, Montreal's celebration is bigger than New York's and goes back much longer. Tens of thousands of people show up in Montreal every St. Patrick's Day to celebrate the city's diversity. French Canadians, English Canadians, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, Latin Americans and Africans, Vietnamese and Native Americans have transformed March 17th into a celebration of a cosmopolitan and diverse Montreal that has emerged from the social and political trauma of the 20th century. They've done so in large measure because of the arrival of thousands of migrants. The United Irish Societies of Montreal, the organizers of the parade, are proud of their holiday's new role as a symbol of diversity and of tolerance. For the 180th Montreal St. Patrick's Day parade in 2004, they chose a young woman of color for the first time to preside over their parade. Tara Heckscher is a 21-year-old Montrealer. She has an Irish father and a Nigerian mother. She grew up in Nigeria before going to London and moving to Montreal to study at McGill. She was the parade's first queen. That's the cover of the book. And she was the first black queen, although there had already been Irish Italian, Irish Quebecois, Irish Inuit St. Patrick's Day parade queens in Montreal. As UIS spokesperson Jalon Ditton told reporters as he was announcing her coronation, "I think it's great. Montreal is a mixed cultural society, and I think this is nothing but good for the community." That's not a statement people in Montreal were saying 40 years ago. The dramatic evolution of Montreal politics from the 1960s until 2006 reflects deep social, economic, and cultural changes that have taken place in the city. I argue in the book in some detail that this transformation is being institutionalized in new political arrangements and practices. Such profound changes in Montreal and how the city functions exposes the extent to which the arrival of transnational migrants can change the broad economic, social, and urban context. Despite all of the tensions and conflicts of the past 40 years, the story of Montreal reveals how metropolitan communities can create new capacity for accommodating diversity. Cities can reinvent themselves as sites of diversity capital production. Turning to Washington, the District of Columbia and the Washington metropolitan region are expanding their capacities to accommodate diversity. I think we all feel this. New diversity capital is being created, as I think the following story illustrates. 4 decades ago, Kelly and Maze Tesfaye arrived in Washington from Addis Ababa to study biology and business. Caught by changing political fortunes at home in Ethiopia, a few years of study in Washington turned into decades of life here in D.C. 15 years after stepping off their plane in Washington, Kelly and Maze had accumulated a small nest egg from various modestly paying jobs. Looking around, they decided they would be better off owning a restaurant than working as waitresses in the restaurants of others. And using all of their savings, they invested in a small storefront at 5516 Colorado Avenue Northwest, not very far east of the Carter Barron Amphitheater along the traditional racial boundary zone of Rock Creek Park. From these modest beginnings have emerged 2 of DC's best jazz venues, Twins Lounge on Colorado Avenue and Twins Jazz at 14th and U. The Tesfaye sisters made everyone who walked into their club, black, white, Asian, Hispanic, young, old, rich, poor, jazz lovers, jazz novices, they made everyone feel welcome. And they're an example of how new diversity capital is being created in Washington every day. These stories illustrate the larger point I'm trying to make in the book. Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv are different cities than they were just a few decades ago. They're more comfortable with diversity. They have greater capacity to accommodate diversity, both formal capacity in terms of official institutions and informal capacity in terms of changing patterns of social relations. They have accumulated greater stores of diversity capital. Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv today are closer to the great cosmopolitan centers in New York and Amsterdam than they were 40 years ago. These 3 cities have become gateways for transnational migrants to pass into larger host societies. St. Patrick's Day Queen Tara Heckscher, jazz entrepreneurs Kelly and Maze Tesfaye, and Kyiv's intrepid Mahmoud personify deeper changes that are transforming their hometowns. I present Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv as illustrations of broad processes that modify urban reality every day as capital and human beings circulate more rapidly on a global scale. Their stories reveal the continuing capacity of cities to absorb new life, to transform themselves, and to provide opportunities for long-term and short-term residents alike. They represent examples of how a city's diversity capital can expand at a moment when cities around the world must learn how to enhance their capacity to deal with diversity. Still, it might seem that it's a strange selection of cities. So you can appreciate how, right after the book came out, it came out in November, December I was looking at the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and I was kind of surprised. Lisa Benton Short, Marie Price, and Samantha Friedman try to rank 116 global immigrant cities around the world and create a global immigration urban hierarchy. And they go through and they have various criteria they use to judge, and they sort out different groups. And there's an alpha group of the leading urban immigrant centers, those at the top of the immigrant hierarchy. And there are a few surprises here. New York, Toronto, Dubai, Los Angeles, London, Sydney, Miami, Melbourne, Amsterdam, and Vancouver. Then they have a second tier, what they call beta cities. And this is where it gets interesting. That list includes Riyadh, Geneva, Paris, Tel Aviv, The Hague, San Francisco, Perth, Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv. So maybe by instinct I was stumbling upon something that social scientists have been able to demonstrate more rigorously. To get back to my earlier point, one of the things that this study taught me is that we need to think about Kyiv and Ukraine not just as post-Soviet cities and societies, but cities and societies which can and should be compared outside the context of the former Soviet Union. Finally, and Mike already mentioned this, and I appreciate that he did, in pursuing the arguments to my book, I'm attempting to pay homage to a friend and a colleague, the Russian scholar and politician Galina Vasilyevna Starovoitova, who, as Mike mentioned, was murdered on the staircase leading to her apartment in November 1998. Galia profoundly believed in the fundamental dignity of human existence. She was a forceful defender of individual liberty, she was a colleague, and she was a friend. Galia adamantly believed that ethnic communities transform the cities in which they're found for the better. Her spirit is perhaps best communicated by a passage from Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. Unscrew the locks from the doors, unscrew the doors themselves from their jambs. Galia paid for her beliefs with her life. She did so because she and we live in a time in which Whitman's call for throwing open our societies and ourselves frightens more than it inspires. Heightened anxiety over terrorism has cast suspicion on the city as a social form and on transnational migrants as a social phenomena. The impulse to draw oneself into a cocoon of homogeneity increasingly undermines the celebration of difference. The recent experiences of Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv highlight an alternative reality and a dangerous world. Voluntarily or not, all three cities have come to represent lively centers of diversity, lively centers which point the way to an alternative possible 21st century metropolitan future. Despite all of their obvious imperfections, and we all live with these imperfections every day, the robust intercultural vitality suggests possible sources for successful strategies to create and accumulate diversity capital. Visit the Lavochki in Troyeshina, the dépanneurs of Côte de Neige, or the corner convenience stores in Mount Pleasant. Walt Whitman's spirit and Galina Vasilyeva Starovoitova's spirit, their spirit are alive. And all of us who live in cities such as Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv are the better for it. Thank you.
You consider standing.
Either way, if you're ready to go.
Up to you. I thought you would.
We'll go this way.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I don't get to address an audience on the topic of Ukraine and Canada, or Kyiv and Montreal at the same time. Actually, it's a first. Maybe a last, but it's a first. Because I'm Montreal born. I studied and worked for 15 years in the U.S. Now I'm at the University of Ottawa, the Chair of Ukraine Studies, for 3 years. So I've got this personal Montreal connection, and I'm in Ukraine Studies, something obvious here. My Washington connection, that is, if I have an emotional Montreal connection, since I've lived through the experience of the transformation of Montreal into a culturally diverse city, is ironic. That is, I experienced the pain of losing my baseball team to the other growing culturally diverse city, Washington. So there you go. We've all linked. Although, as I was telling Blair just before the session started, one of the numerous arguments that we've read, I read with great pain in the summer of 2004, in the fall, was that one of the reasons people here in Washington are hopeful that it's going to work this time, the team's going to stick, is because the base of the city, I mean the demography of the city has changed so much for the better with the Hispanic factor, etc. In any case, Blair has written a very ambitious book on a topic that is of preeminence importance. He's got a key argument, which you could, the key insight, which you could probably summarize the following way: you don't need tolerance to produce tolerance. You don't need a democrat to produce democracy. It's people are forced to become tolerant because of the conditions. People are forced to become democratic because of peculiar conditions. There's an interesting debate going on in the field of Russian-Ukrainian studies at the moment, epitomized by Luke Nui, who's going to be here on the 31st, I believe, scholar at Temple University, trying to explain, why is it that Ukraine's going one way, and actually when you start looking at it, tiny Moldova, about which nobody cares much, geopolitically speaking, is actually also showing a great deal of pluralist resilience. The system is relatively far more open than Russia or Belarus, that definitely are going the other way. And Lucan's argument is actually what you had in Ukraine that was developed before the Orange Revolution. It's actually an argument that you could say could explain even why an Orange Revolution is even possible in the case of Ukraine. Is that you have a pluralism by default that developed in the 1990s in Ukraine and in Moldova. And the main argument here is that all leaders, presidents, they all created presidential institutions, try to reconstitute an authoritarian system from the ashes of the Soviet Union by the mid-90s. Certainly Kuchma did it, very, very nice try. But relatively speaking, failed in Ukraine and Moldova because they just could not get all the elites together, preventing certain elites from defecting. It's all about elite cohesion and reconstituting the so-called vertical of power, where basically your orders will be followed from top to bottom. And the key argument is that, well, they couldn't because the elites are divided on a cultural factor. Region, language. In the case of Moldova, they don't know if they're Moldovan, Romanian, etc. I can't go into the details, but culture explains why is it that they just can't bring everybody back together. And we've seen in the Orange Revolution, certainly we kept hearing before the election that the election will be stolen because Kuchma and this regime have access to all the so-called administrative resources, meaning they control the entire apparatus. Well, it failed miserably. They could not control their whole apparatus in half of the country. And that's Lucan's argument. Now, Blair is telling us, you look at the history of New York and Amsterdam going back, it's not like they were all nicely tolerant vis-à-vis each other. They were forced in the cauldron of city politics basically to work, to build on the basis, to function on the basis of compromise. And he's extrapolating, if you wish, from that interesting experience of New York in particular. That is, he's bringing the argument forward in the recent decades, looking at the experience of the transformation in cities through transnational migration. And he's seen a similarity here that Montreal in particular, which could have gone the Belfast way, in fact, because of its the expansion of its multi-ethnic base and the reality of democratic city politics, had to essentially, for electoralist reasons, starting to listen to the so-called, as we call them in Quebec, cultural communities, communautés culturelles, and we have this compromise. It's not like Quebecers are particularly, no people are innately tolerant. It's a structural situation, which seems to be a success story. Montreal, happy to hear that. I'll have a few words about the peculiar Montreal experience. What's interesting, and a few words later, what's interesting about Blair's ambitious comparison is that he's got three cities that are on a very different stage, if you put that on the continuum of diversity. Montreal being the so-called success story. Washington being at a crucial crossroads, could go either way, but certainly have come a long way from segregation. And Kyiv at the very beginning. So in a sense, we can't say much about Kyiv as to whether it really can grow into a Washington, Montreal. What's hugely significant for Kyiv is that it is becoming an internationally diverse city from a Soviet provincial city, which really what it was for 67 years. Moscow made the alpha list, as you put it. It's amazingly now multi-ethnic from again, as I was telling colleagues before, half jokingly, but you've got just about as many Georgians and Azeris and Chechens in Moscow that you have in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Chechnya, Azerbaijan, and what's my third one? Azerbaijan, Chechnya. In any case, we've seen, in a sense, Moscow becoming the London or the Paris, think of any major Western European capital, of the East. That's the big transformation the past 10 years. It hasn't seeped really into political consciousness. And Kyiv, should we say of all places, because again of its provincial status, is also fast becoming a multi-ethnic city, but multi-ethnic in an international sense. And that's, of course, the key point of the book, international migration. So cities at three different points of the spectrum and interesting possible trajectories, assuming that Montreal has kind of crossed the Rubicon of diversity. Now, on Washington, I'll leave it to my colleague expert, since I'm really an outsider on Washington. I can't comment much on the plausibility, let's say, of taking the culturally diverse route, diversity capital route. In the case of Kyiv, let's say perhaps I would add a caveat in mind, that is, we shouldn't conceptualize Kyiv along necessarily the way of Washington and Montreal, assuming that Washington will take the route of Montreal. There is another route which has been taken by some European cities, and one comes to mind because it's been in the news lately. It's Paris, but Paris writ large, the greater Paris. That is, you've got another model where the international migration, instead of settling in the city, settles in the outer rings of the city. They're called cités in France. And interestingly, in Kyiv, that's exactly where they're settling, the outer, the latest, the newest kind of suburbs of the late Soviet period, like Troeshina. But in a situation at the same time where there is denial on the state side that they actually have an inclusion problem or an exclusion problem, lack of inclusion. In the case of French policy, the official policy is that you cannot even collect data on ethnic background because everybody is a citoyen, everybody's equal, part of the French nation. But the reality, as was certainly pointed out by analysts during the troubles in the fall, is exclusion. And in the case of very blocked upward mobility. So that is also one possible route. Obviously, Blair's model is contingent on some vibrant democratic process at the city level, which remains a project in the case of Kyiv. That is, politicians will start now recognizing the electoral utility of addressing needs of these new immigrants if there's something in for them, like power, because the rules of the game require it. And it's, again, too early for us to see in Kyiv, but indeed, if we see the kind of democratic politics at the city level, which obviously was absent in the Soviet period, then things could change for the better. Let me say a few things specifically on the Montreal and Kyiv experience. On the case of Montreal as a success story, couple of points here. The first is Montreal used to be divided by religion, more religion than language. But it just happened that all the Catholics spoke French and all the Protestants spoke English. So it was like reinforcing cleavage. But the first cleavage was religious. And French-Canadian society, Catholic society, was extremely close. You could not intermarry across the dividing barrier. Now in the 60s, and that's been a worldwide phenomenon, and noticed in Europe as well, with kind of the secularization of society, the dominant way of defining yourself shifted from religion really to language. And that's coincided with the rise of the Nationalist Party in Quebec in the 1960s. Now, what became clear is that for a culturally diverse and tolerant situation to arise, it had to be based on a consensus. I call it a political equilibrium. The sine qua non, let's say, of stable politics and inclusive politics. That is, and Blair mentioned it in his talk, it's got to take place in French. That is, French has to be the dominant, not unique, but dominant language of public intercourse, public communication. And then inclusive policies can take place, but on this basis. So you had to have legislative intervention. The Bill 101, which requires parents of immigrant children to send their kids to French school. Blair said that the international immigrants arrive and they don't have that baggage. They're not emotionally invested in the situation, which is true of the latest waves of immigration. The earlier waves, namely the Greeks and the Italians in particular, were actually very emotionally involved in the debate because they didn't want their kids to go to French school. So interestingly, when you look at some of the troubles in the 60s involved, they were presented as the French versus the Anglos, but in fact it was the Italian immigrants who were demonstrating in Saint Leonard against not Bill 101, but a previous bill that eventually became, after a while, Bill 101. So you had some tense moments that lasted about a decade, but once the law was passed, we've seen now that recognition intergenerationally that indeed things have to take place. That is, not everything is in French, but there is a recognition this is a dominant language. And if it's a dominant language, then non-Francophones have to be able to function in French, because you can't have a situation when French is dominant if you have unilingual Anglophones, or immigrants and children and immigrants will function in their own language and in English. That doesn't work. They have to be bi or trilingual, which is what happened. So a very significant demographic change in terms of attitudes and behavior. It's very hard to find now in Anglophone and young Allophone. Not first, that is the generation born here, that's not able to function in French. That's the basis. And then, indeed, with the incentive of democratic politics, increasingly, then parties on both sides of the divide, whether they're for preservation of the federation or for the independence of Quebec, are trying now, or targeting increasingly what you call the transnational immigrants and their children. And you see that in politics, since we had an election on Monday. I can give you just a little flavor. And one of the stories of that election is that the Bloc Québécois, the separatists, kind of a strange bird in Canadian Quebec politics, we have a separatist party that actually sends deputies in the federal parliament called the Bloc Québécois, because we have a provincial party called the Parti Québécois, and we have the Bloc Québécois. And now, the Bloc Québécois actually have now quite a few deputies that are transnational immigrants or children of. And we have a deputy from Rwanda and Lebanon, you name it. I mean, it's becoming routine now. So you see that really powerful impact here of the integration of the so-called others. And even Another interesting story in the election is some of the ridings in the Montreal area that always went for the Liberal would never vote for the PQ or the BQ, BQ being the Bloc Québécois, because everything goes by language. If you, the more a riding is Anglophone, then the less the chances of the PQ and BQ getting any support. Zero, basically. West Island is completely liberal in this sense. Then if you have ridings where the proportion of so-called allophones, now what is an allophone? That sounds a bit strange, but an allophone is someone whose first language is neither French nor English, so other. Allo comes from other. And these allophones now are being precisely wooed by politicians, and but generally vote against the PQ, the BQ. I suppose on the assumption that they didn't come to Canada to separate from it. But now the Bloc actually won elections in several of these ridings. Well, you start looking at the result, it's because there was a struggle between three different parties. They kind of managed to get the upper hand, but you don't need a majority. I can't get into the details. Anyway, statistically, nothing really changed, but because of the struggle between three different parties, they won elections. But again, it's something totally unthinkable from 20 years ago, that you would have critical ridings. Basically, the critical ridings were precisely the ridings of transnational immigrants. So they're part of the, let's call it the stuff of politics. And you see it on a daily basis. On the one hand, a general acceptance of the equilibrium, the status quo. That is, this is, okay, Quebec has to function in French. We don't like it, but we accept it. Meaning, you know, our kids go to French school, etc. And then on the other hand, increasingly in the newspapers and politics, you see that kind of presence. In other words, Quebec politics is becoming de-ethnicized along your argument. In the case of Kyiv now, and to conclude my my comments. Now, Kyiv, as I said, transformed itself from being a provincial Soviet city to a multi-ethnic city. Let's say the division in Kyiv, before you start taking into account the international immigrants. If the division in Montreal was initially religious, then became linguistic, in Kyiv it's a little more complex. That is, historically Kyiv was, let's call it, a Russian imperial city. So with a Russian bourgeoisie, but which was in fact a bit like a Pied Noir bourgeoisie in Algeria, was coming from all over, but become, you know, people identifying as Russians. But you had a significant Polish presence, Jewish presence, and so forth, but very little Ukrainian. They were like rural people. I'm talking before the revolution. So you have the Bolshevik Revolution, and then it's not like you had ethnic cleansing, but you had class cleansing. Of course, the bourgeoisie as a class was eliminated by the Soviet Union, understood. And since the Russians were largely the bourgeoisie in Kyiv, or the Poles, they kind of disappeared as a class, and then the cataclysm of the 30s with the purges, and then the Holocaust with the Jewish population, Babi Yar, and Second World Wars. So you don't really have a residue of that Russian-Ukrainian kind of division or cleavage in Kyiv because of the rather painful history. What you had under the Soviet is, in a sense, the Ukrainianization, not linguistically, but ethnically, of the city. That increasingly people in the city define themselves as Ukrainians. They came from the countryside. Immigration to the city, urbanization. To the point now Ukraine is, 75-80% Ukrainian. And then everybody has a babushka, babusia in the countryside. And these are fairly recent kind of migration to the city. You still have a Russian presence, but when you start talking to people who call themselves Russians, but in fact they're half Ukrainian, half this, one-third that, and it's extremely, extremely mixed, and you don't have, again, that the roots don't go too deep because of this peculiar Soviet history. But what you do have, Blair talks in his book about a more private division. That is, Ukrainian, certainly language until 1991 was hardly heard in Kyiv street. Now you can hear it, of course, but it's overwhelmingly still Russian-speaking, even though overwhelmingly people will say that they're Ukrainian. So you've got a Russian-speaking Ukrainian city. People used to be ashamed to speak Ukrainian in public. On top of it, in the Soviet Union, it wasn't exactly wasn't well perceived when you were autonomously, spontaneously speaking Ukrainian in public, particularly in the public setting. You had to do it following the party edicts. So people just internalized that in Kyiv, it's more modern to speak Russian, and it's certainly more politically safe in any case. That's the history. But then, people internalize, and that's how they develop. And Kyiv is remaining largely Russian-speaking, again, informally, but more and more Ukrainian-speaking formally. You go to parliament, you go to institutions, the government, you go to universities, the Mochila, the Shevchenko University, you hear Ukrainian. Ukrainian, you hear a lot on TV. You hear Russian a lot too, but Ukrainian has a presence, and the more... It's a bit strange, because the more up you go, the more you hear Ukrainian, and the more you go the street level, the more Russian you hear. So is there really a division that international migrants could dissipate, let's say? It's not clear. It's not clear if language plays that role, the kind of role that it played in Montreal, that race played in Washington. It's unclear. In Kyiv itself, it plays a role nationally, but in Kyiv itself, it's not clear. It could very well be that the divisions are otherwise. And again, the other issue is we don't have much of a tradition of democratic politics in Kyiv. It's so new. So since it's not clear, it could very well be that the task, let's say, or the likelihood of these transnational immigrants that are growing, it's largely unrecorded. If you look at census data, you won't see that much of that, because they don't like to register themselves. But if you do the kind of analysis that Blair, Nancy, and the others have done at ground level, you see that there are far many of them, far more of them than one you would expect, to the point that you can start thinking of Kyiv as an incipient, city of international immigration. It actually made the top 20, right? So you're not the only one who's recognized that trend. Ukraine happens also to be now part of this route, international route, from the south, from the Caucasus, from Asia to Europe. So it is, from that perspective, that has changed tremendously. But if language in Kyiv doesn't prove to be that contested between groups, that is Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers, it could then actually facilitate the development of a Western European model. I'm not generalizing here, but a model more of exclusion. That is, you don't build capital, diversity capital. You just deny that you have a problem, that these people even exist or should be there in the first place, which again is not a post-Soviet phenomenon, but a international and certainly European phenomenon. I'll just, in closing, give you one example. I've written mostly in my career on Ukrainian or Russian matters, but once I actually wrote an article comparing Montreal with two other cities, Barcelona and Brussels, on this, again, on this issue of language, the role of language, religion, and what I call political stability. So there was some comparison with what you were doing. What struck me when I was looking at the Brussels case, in Brussels you have a situation where you have Dutch speakers from Flanders, French speakers, and the city is actually located in Flanders, even though it has the status of the capital and officially is bilingual, because the political equilibrium in Belgium, in a nutshell, since the 1930s is that half of the country is only Dutch, half of the country is only French, and then the enclave, the capital, is officially bilingual, 50-50. The reality is, despite all the laws and political agreements and incentives and so forth, that is attempt to build incentives, is that the vast majority of Dutch speakers who moved historically to Brussels became French speakers. That's the reality. You go to Brussels, you hear 95% French. Flip the channels, it's French and Dutch because it's subsidized by the state. You see it's 50-50, but you don't hear it in the street. That's the reality. So I was looking at that dynamics. Again, lots of parallels in terms of discourse that I see in Ukraine speakers, Russian speakers, in Montreal, etc. But what struck me was that 25% of the actually living population in Brussels is actually international immigrants. But they're not quite recorded because most of them don't have citizenships and whatnot. And the reality, it seems, is 99% of them go to French school. So their children will become French speaker, as we see in Canada, with visible minority type. But they're totally absent from the debate. And that is French and Dutch activists or analysts are still focused on this good old dynamics, which, and again, in a state of denial. So I guess the question relating to Blair's book is that in order to build diversity capital, you need a cognitive shift. You need first to start thinking of your city in different terms. And the incentive is electoral. It seems that it hasn't triggered in Brussels because it seems they don't have the right to vote. I'm going to need to recheck my notes, but they seem to have been in their citizenship issue. Once you have that civic integration, that these migrants are not just temporary, they're there to stay, and politicians begin then to start using their arsenal of tricks to get support in immigrant communities, then the cognitive shift will follow. I will take it that's your key argument. And in Kyiv, we're a long way from there, but it's what Blair has shown us is that the French model, let's say the Belgian model, of rather denial, and let's hope everything will be fine if we don't need to really be concerned too much about that, is not the only way to go. There is another model. But if Washington is at the crossroad, well, Kyiv is at the incipient stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominique. That's very good. Audrey Singer will be our next discussant, and then we'll open it up.
I want to congratulate Blair and thank him for writing the book and thank him for inviting me to be here today to comment on it, because there are many ways to read a book, and having this kind of reading assignment is really, really nice, especially when it's on a topic that you really love. So happily I was given this opportunity to read the book and read it with purpose and to comment on its significance and content. The book offers 3 illustrations of how urban areas are changed by immigrants and how immigrants alter group dynamics, politics, and institutions, while at the same time becoming part of the social environment in their own terms. And diversity capital is what is created when urban areas defined largely, in these cases, by long-standing binary terms, are redefined by large-scale immigration and become more cosmopolitan in nature. And the way that immigrants intersect the socio-political, linguistic, race, ethnic setting has been important in these 3 urban areas, first in the cities and now in the broader metropolitan context. The book describes 3 places in different stages in a cycle of urban change where immigrants are transforming previously historically divided terrain. And I'd like to explore the concept of diversity capital further and highlight what I see as some of the important variables between these 3 places and the resulting policy challenges. In other words, in the creation of diversity capital, how does place matter? How does the national policy context matter? And what are the challenges to creating diversity capital? So on the first point, this book makes a very good case about how regional aspects of metropolitan areas should not be ignored. In each of the three places, we see trends in urban development that are creating very complex metropolitan areas. The development of suburban areas means that housing and transportation and jobs have all become decentralized. It also means that policies and governments tend to be fragmented, sometimes explicitly, as in the case of Washington, or implicitly, as in the case of Kyiv. So in this vein, chapter 2 of the book examines residential patterns of immigrants and longtime residents, a dimension that intersects with the creation of diversity capital in everyday life. Whereas Montreal and Washington's North American-style suburbs are less dense than Kyiv's suburban, high-rise apartment building, more European style, these areas where immigrants live in large numbers represent a social environment that is different than those found in more traditional central cities and historically in central cities. So the questions that are out there is, what does this mean, this whole decentralization, fragmentation, suburbanization? What does this mean for getting to know one's neighbors, for who attends school together, for civic participation and political representation, and ultimately for creating diversity capital? That is, how does the use of physical space create the social space to incorporate immigrant newcomers into the political and the social and the economic structure? And to some degree, diversity capital represents the two-way integration process that I think about a lot, where immigrants change the places where they live, and the resident population institutions also adapt to newcomers. In the case of Montreal, well, all three places. In the case of Montreal, Washington, and Kyiv, this incorporation is occurring on top of these long-held dualities that we've been talking about, and they run along language and racial lines. So what I want to bring out here is that the national context of reception is an important variable for understanding how these three places differ in this process of incorporation. And here I'm borrowing from the sociologist Alejandro Portes of Princeton University, who has focused on how three particular dimensions of the host society make a difference in the favorable integration of immigrants. And these three dimensions are the host labor market conditions, whether the policies of the receiving government are welcoming and inclusive, and the presence and characteristics of co-ethnic communities. This perspective maintains that together, these three contexts condition the extent to which immigrant human capital can be brought into play to promote successful economic and social adaptation. And I find it relevant and similar to the urban social sustainability concept. And in particular, I want to focus on the second context that I mentioned, the policies of the receiving governments. Montreal is a historically divided city, as we've heard. In some ways, itself resistant to integrating into the national Canadian identity. But Canada also has an explicit multicultural policy. And I don't know too much about it, so I may get some things wrong here. But passed in 1971, it grew out of British-French tensions and aimed to recognize the pluralism, including Native Indian groups, that existed. It made both English and French official languages while encouraging a Canadian national identity regardless of background. And by the 1980s and 1990s, this multiculturalism policy had new constituents. Instead of protecting more traditional Canadian heritages, immigrant newcomers also looked to this national policy as protection against discrimination and as insurance for access to jobs, education, and housing. And so Canada's explicit multicultural policy has become an integration and incorporation policy, and this plays out on the ground also in Montreal and across other cities and communities in Canada. Washington is a different case. Long identified as the original chocolate city, which Mayor Nagin last week famously declared New Orleans will become once again. Washington, as the nation's capital, has always had international ties. However, it's only recently joined the ranks of major metropolitan immigrant destinations within the United States. And metropolitan Washington fits into a class of U.S. metropolitan areas that have recently emerged as new immigrant gateways. Places like New York and Chicago have continuously held an attraction for immigrants throughout the 20th century and before that as well. And other large metropolitan areas such as Los Angeles and Houston saw their foreign-born populations grow rapidly after World War II. However, in the 1980s and in the 1990s, settlement patterns began to shift away from the more traditional settlement areas to many places with little history of immigration. And my own work on the historical settlement patterns of U.S. immigrants places Washington, along with Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, Orlando, and Las Vegas, in the category of emerging immigrant gateways, places that have themselves blossomed as major metropolitan areas in the last few decades of the 20th century, becoming significant immigrant destinations due to their burgeoning job markets, particularly in the construction, services, and technology sectors. And as this book points out, in 1970, less than 5% of Greater Washington's population was born outside the United States. 95% were native born. By 2000, 1 in 6 persons, or 17% of metropolitan Washington's population, was foreign born. While the entire metropolitan area's population has grown by 54% in the past 30 years, during the same time, the immigrant population grew more than 6 times its size. And as Blair points out in the book and in his comments today, it's taken a while for Washington to catch up, its own identity to catch up with these trends. It's now the 7th largest metropolitan concentration of immigrants in the United States, and the majority are residing outside the central city and in the suburbs. And on the language note, region-wide, 21% of metropolitan Washington communicates in non-English languages at home, 1 out of 5. So that's a very different setup than what we had just 30 years ago. So in terms of this national policy context, the kinds of programs and policies that exist in the United States to assist immigrants in the incorporation process can best be described as ad hoc, reactive, and localized. With the exception of our refugee resettlement program, states and cities and counties are the players. They play the de facto role of developing and maintaining policies and programs that help immigrants adjust and adapt. And so the national context of reception in the United States just sort of rests on the ideology that the United States is a country of immigrants, that you or your parents can be from China or the Dominican Republic or Russia and still be American. But there's no explicit, coordinated national policy to incorporate immigrants. And the Kyiv example presents an altogether different case. For one thing, it is a city in a newly formed state, and as the book makes clear, the historical complexity of Kyiv's identity are both linguistic and religious, but so blended in recent generations, they're not manifested in a spatial way, as they are in parts of Washington and parts of Montreal. Current political traumas and the resulting instability might mean that Kyiv's context of reception is vastly different and may stay that way for a while. Ukraine and the former Soviet Union were relatively closed societies where little international migration took place. Incorporating transnational newcomers with as varied geographical, religious, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds as Kyiv is seeing now, such as the Iraqi, Vietnamese, Pakistani, and African immigrants, it's not an easy process. And as Blair points out in the book, Ukraine is in a different stage of the process than Canada and the United States, 2 of the world's biggest receivers of immigrants. So the question is, and Dominique spent some time on this, is whether these immigrants are long-term stayers in Kyiv, or whether they'll see themselves as part of the community there, or might they just view Ukraine as a way station and move on to greener diversity capital pastures. My third point is about the challenges of creating diversity capital, and I want to touch on a few things. The first is language, and language is a key variable running through the analysis in this book. Language differences within the base population, the resident population, is a more obvious issue in both Montreal and Kyiv. And it'll continue to be a big issue among immigrant newcomers, especially as they come more and more from different countries, continue to diversify. But if Washington is a model, given how diverse in national and ethnic origins its immigrant population is, this is going to be one of the greatest challenges to inclusion and participation. And we can talk more later about some of the language issues in Washington and how it differs from these other places, but I think we have immigrants from just about every country in the world here, and the languages that come with that are incredible, and the mixture at the local level and in schools is really, really confounding. The second challenge that I want to talk about is suburbanization, or just remind you, we've already spent some time talking about it, but what I think is important to think about here is how much more fragmented services and programs are related to the sustainability of diverse populations when you have a very suburbanized form and settlement of immigrants in suburbs. And then I think ultimately we need to go beyond sustainability, and we should be thinking about mobility, economic mobility, and the other types of integration that make people become part of the places where they live. Third are resources, and here both material and human resources are important. Given the argument made in the book about how the three urban areas represent three distinct phases in the creation of diversity capital, public and private resources that help this process along may need to be increased. And there's a great example in the book about the Language Access Act creation in Washington and the formation of the Office on Latino Affairs and Asian Affairs. And last month there was also a public hearing about the creation of an Office on African Affairs, which probably won't happen because I don't think enough diversity capital has been created yet. The district government doesn't feel like there are enough African immigrants living here. And the fourth and the last point I want to make is about public sentiment. And at least in the United States, right now there's a growing anti-immigrant sentiment that's being stoked in part by national groups, but also by many of the changes underway in local areas. And in particular, local areas that have little experience in dealing with a rapid influx of immigrants or refugees are often unprepared and react strongly. The current dispersal of immigrants across areas in the United States means that immigration is now a prominent feature in many regions of the country that until recently had little experience with immigration. So small towns in Iowa and Kentucky, big cities in North Carolina find they have significant numbers of Latinos in their communities, while towns in upstate New York and Maine have new populations of Somali refugees. And on the local front, if you've been following the case of Herndon, tensions can really flare up at the very local level. One of the main messages that this book conveys is that the political and the policy agenda is no longer written in French and English, as in the case of Montreal, or Russian and Ukrainian, as in Kyiv, or in black and white, as in Washington. And increasingly, policy must incorporate other groups that in the past decade or two have inserted themselves into public life and in these three metropolitan areas. And I think this is a very important message. And so I want to thank you again for the opportunity to read and comment on this engaging book. And I want to mention that it's not likely that many other books mention between the front and back covers Major League Baseball, The Soviet Hammer and Sickle, and Barbra Streisand. So it's a very worthwhile read and a valuable contribution to the literature on new waves of immigration in the newest destinations. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Audrey. We have a few minutes here for some questions and comments, and I'd like to give Blair Rubel a chance to say anything he'd like to say to the two commentators before we open it up. Blair?
Well, I'll be very quick, but there is an obvious question that's come up about Kyiv. And it's really interesting when the issue of denial, when we went and we talked to a number of city officials in Kyiv. I think they would prefer not to confront the issue. But when you go and you talk to people in hospitals, to school directors, they're the ones who are on the front line. And the comment about U.S. policy being ad hoc and reactive, I think that's exactly what is taking place in Kyiv right now. But there also is an evolution that is taking place. When we did our surveys, we were looking primarily at Kyiv, well, we were looking solely at Kyiv, and we were primarily looking at groups from outside the former Soviet Union. But in the last couple of years, there's been a very heightened increase of immigration to Ukraine from the South Caucasus. And this is a process which has caught the attention of national and local political leaders in Ukraine. The problem is no one quite knows how many people we're talking about. If you look at official registries, there's about 100,000 foreigners living in Kyiv. If you go and talk to in 2001, I had a conversation with the Deputy Minister of the Interior who said, well, that number is way off. It's really closer to 200,000. But then people said that's because he wants his budget to grow. But the longer-term trend, I think, is very clear, and it was expressed by Kuchma's last, the office that deals with this question has been a ministry, a state committee. It keeps changing. At the time, it was a state committee. And I met with him in September 2nd or 3rd, 2004, and that becomes an important date. He looked at me and he said, yesterday was the first day of school in Ukraine. There were 400,000 fewer new school kids entering school for the first time this year than there were when Ukraine became independent in 2001. You take a look at this territory, the people who are going to be living here 50 years from now are not the people who are living here now. We have to do something. And I think that's the level at which this becomes an issue in Ukraine, with facing the demographic reality of a shrinking population. The fact that, sure, most of the people we interviewed didn't expect to remain in Ukraine, but they can't. There's now a hard border with Europe. They get to Ukraine, and the question is really whether or not Ukrainian policymakers are going to have the wisdom to try to capitalize on this opportunity, or in fact will they remain in denial? I think that's the fundamental question about what will happen in Ukraine. I think it's very much like as if you were looking at Europe after World War II. The people are going to come, but the question is whether or not the institutions are going to respond.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up and maybe identify yourself, and you'll get a microphone over here. Jen? Yeah.
Leonard Oberlander. This is so timely and so comprehensive, and congratulations on.
Buy a book.
I am, and I can't wait to read it. I've tried to put my arms around some of the major concepts that I have a question about. Blair, you mentioned the human capital, people being acted upon versus being actors. And Dr. Ariel brought up cognitive shift and talk about public policies. Human capital can be invested in people as human capital, or it can be invested in employment as unskilled or skilled labor. They can be invested in the arts as creators or performers, as starters of small businesses, etc. Or they can be invested or spent, if you will, in government programs, such as welfare and other government support programs. Two very different kinds of investments. It seems to me that the investment of human capital in the former is creating actors, people who are doing something, people who have some independent kinds of opportunities to behave in a constructive way. People who are in the government programs are being acted on by politics and government programs and are dependent. as not being able to be as creative and independent. So we have independent versus dependent people. The independence or dependence can be a cognitive style, a personality trait, or it can be imposed upon people by governments and policies. And I think that's what you may be alluding to about where Ukraine may be going in the future as a matter of public policy. And it also seems to make sense that people who are independent and are in an area where they are acted upon and in a welfare situation may migrate, tend to migrate to areas where they have greater opportunity and independence. And in the opposite way, those people who have a dependent predisposition will migrate from areas where they're expected to be more creative and responsible to areas where they are more dependent. Is this a model that you think is consistent with what you might predict from the work that you've done to date?
Well, I think that the communities I'm looking at, these are all immigrants who have picked up and moved, and I think in all three cities what we see is that they're adding considerable dynamism to local economies. And the figures on, I have some of them in the book, but you just pick up the Washington Post, the figures on the number of Hispanic businesses in the Washington area and the employment that is dependent upon immigrant capital in the Washington area is huge, and similarly in Montreal. In Ukraine, there is no state service safety net that is viable. So anybody who ends up in Ukraine is going to have to figure out a way on his or her own to make a go of it. And what has tended to happen in Ukraine, and one reason why this Transnational market became so large, is that you have the added complication in Ukraine of so much of the economy being gray and fuzzy, and with questionable legal status, that's exactly where people migrated into trade. And a lot of the immigrant communities we're looking at in Kyiv are traders, with the exception of the Africans. The African community in Kyiv is very interesting because it is there the longest. It is in many ways the most integrated into Ukrainian society, and it is the most bitter of all the communities. And probably in some ways the most dependent because they've been there longer. They tended to work in state enterprises. The Afghans, the Kurds, the Azeris who have come, these are people who are really making their own in a very independent way. And they're in Kyiv because they're independent enough to pick up and move in the first place.
Do either of you want to comment on that before we go on to another question? Bill Miller, and then over here.
Thank you, Blair, and the others for really a brilliant presentation. I'd like to comment a little bit on Kyiv. It seems to me that the migrations that produced the Kyiv of Soviet times can fall into various stages. Certainly after the civil wars and after the famine, and certainly after the Great Patriotic War, World War II, the migrations into Kyiv were dramatic, huge numbers, coming not only from the villages of Ukraine and other cities, but from all over the Soviet Union. And you have to remember that Kyiv, after Leningrad and Moscow, was the place for people to go for education and advancement. And people migrated in large numbers to Kyiv long before independence. The present Prime Minister of Ukraine is one of these hybrids. His family comes from a great distance, And many of the deported peoples who were sent out of Ukraine and Crimea in the 30s and in the aftermath of World War II, much less the back and forth of World War II, are signs of the diversity, a great diversity that was possible in the Soviet Union. So I think what you're talking about, Blair and Dominique, is a continuation, really, of what was happening earlier in the Soviet time. You don't find the migration from the West going east. Saakashvili is a good example of people going to Kyiv. His education is at the universities in Kyiv. His classmates were people like Poroshenko and Yushchenko. This kind of interaction is something that's very typical. The new quantities, I would say, are from Afghanistan and Asia, and the fit is the most difficult because they don't share the Soviet experience. But it's a wonderful thing that you've opened up here, the beginnings of a great new city based on new democratic conditions, and I want to compliment you for it.
Thank you.
Blair, any? The gentleman over here.
Wayne Mary, Blair, I'd like to ask you a question about ethnic community formation in Kyiv. Because as I understand it, I mean, there's a difference of that city with the other two. Montreal and Washington are, for most immigrants who come there, their ultimate goals, whether for permanent residence or to earn money before they go back to their home countries. In the case of Kyiv, at least certainly for people from outside of the countries of the former Soviet bloc, it's sort of their ultimate goal was usually someplace farther west, and they couldn't get there because of the Schengen Wall and other reasons. Has this inhibited the growth of what we would think of as normal immigrant flows that lead to the development of communities? The little Saigons, the little Kabuls, the little this, the little that you see that are the classic thing in which one family goes somewhere and then other members of that family, that village, the community, and it sort of builds. But ultimately you can almost trace it back to one person. Is that kind of thing developing in Kyiv, or is it a less amorphous, less cohesive immigration of people who are sort of accidental migrants to Kyiv, as opposed to that being the place where they wanted to go because someone they knew was already there?
Well, I use the strange term transnational migrant on purpose, and I explained it in the book, but I think it actually reflects the reality of life in the 21st century than the notion of immigrant. And that where a person is at any one time in his or her life can vary and is not necessarily permanent. And it may, more people may seem to say that they want to move to Canada or they want to move to the United States and they want to move to Ukraine. But the reality of life is that most of the people who end up in Ukraine thinking they're going to get to Europe are going to be in Ukraine. And in the surveys, you'll see this. I think, I forget the exact number, but something like 80% of our immigrant respondents said, sure, they had plans to move, and usually it was Europe or the United States, but only 5 or 10% had very specific plans where they knew how they were going to get a ticket. So I think the Afghan community in particular is a dynamic community in which people are coming and going all the time. But one reason why it's in Kyiv is a legacy of the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. And the people who were there because they had relatives who were there already. And Kyiv became an attractive location because of students who had studied there during the war and so on and so forth. So the tale of the Afghan community, which is the largest one in Kyiv, in particular, is not that different from the process you described, even though there's this constant coming and going. In terms of social organization, Ukraine is a very interesting situation because there is a a tendency to pick up the discourse of Europe among Ukrainian elites and journalists and politicians and talk about how there are all of these people coming in and they're lowering the health standards and so on and so forth. And then you sit down and you talk to senior Ukrainian government officials and you find out immigrants are healthier than the native Ukrainian population. You do a poll and you find out that one of the biggest problems among immigrant communities is the rise of tuberculosis after they're in Ukraine. You begin to find out that there are social organizations that in some ways these communities are better organized because they have a tradition of self-organization. And what the Transnational market is an informal, self-organized market as you would find outside many cities in the world, but there's not a tradition of that in Ukraine. So you have this very strange, and you also have the fact that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are now living in Europe. So Ukraine is a very unusual situation where there's a lot of dynamism, there's a lot of turnover, and in some ways the social capital, if you will, of the immigrant communities is actually higher than the indigenous social capital in Ukraine itself.
Dominique, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, about Montreal. Generally, I talk about Ukraine, but now you put me on the spot. 2/3, at least, it's in that range, of immigrants who come to Montreal don't stay. So actually Montreal, immigrants don't come to Montreal, they come to Canada. Or they used to come to North America. And I'll give you the example of my wife's family from Greece. After the war, 7 came, well, one after the other, like the usual pattern. And then 6 went to the US and 1 returned, but 5 are in New York and 2 in Montreal. I suppose now it's more complicated with passports and so forth, changing countries. But the pattern is really they're immigrating to Canada. Then many of them discovered that, well, Montreal is not quite like the rest of Canada. It's one thing to have your children educated in French, but those who are actually immigrating, the cost of obviously functioning in an environment when French is a premium is higher than to immigrate to Toronto or elsewhere. And there are just, other opportunities. So that's been the pattern. The prediction in the 70s was that since, despite all the laws and the incentives, you can't expect 80 or 85% of the immigrant population to assimilate into French. And 80 to 85% of the population has been steadily, over the past century, the proportion of French speakers in Quebec. Then inexorably, the proportion will go down. It was like the clarion call of nationalism. But then a demographer discovered in the 70s that no, it will never happen. Well, it hasn't happened, and it's not likely to happen because of this recurrent incentives of moving on to, in particular, Toronto or elsewhere in Canada. So in that sense, it could be actually the story of most international immigrant movements. Mm-hmm. It's a multi-step movement. Yeah.
Can I add a few things on there? Because I think this is an interesting question about how permanent is migration, what does temporary migration mean? I mean, it's relevant for a big discussion we're having now in the U.S., and there are lots of parallels. I mean, the U.S., of course, has long history and, lots of administrative issues around letting people in, but I think what we've seen in terms of the development of local communities who are in a particular place, they are affected by expectations of return. But even when people do feel like they're coming here temporarily, say a Mexican laborer who comes with a target of earning $10,000 in mind or something like that, there's always these other things that happen that either prevent them from returning or induce them to stay. So it's pretty complicated in terms of how you perceive the community. And then a few other things that I just want to pick up on. The whole issue of sort of under the table migration in Kyiv. I mean, obviously we have that in Washington as well. And we have several different kinds of people that don't necessarily show up in the census or on the books. We have people here who are in a temporary protected status, which is where a lot of Salvadorans and some Africans in the region have this limbo status where they're here legally but not permanently, and with some uncertainty about return. But we also have a lot of unauthorized people who are here, living here, working here, and generally speaking, they're part of our community, they're part of households, they're very mixed in terms of legal statuses within households. So there are some parallels there as well. And then just finally about social networks, they are important in terms of determining destinations and thinking about these places as places. So,
Thank you for that. Yes.
I'm wondering if you could
Identify
speak.
yourself.
Sorry, I'm Hamu Talbernstein. I'm a graduate student in the government department at Georgetown, actually. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more specifically about the mechanism by which diversity leads to this sort of increased tolerance. I'm assuming you talk about this in greater detail in your book, but is it really the immigrants participating in local government, or is it more just having the presence of this diversity and sort of changing norms and kind of this sense of tolerance and cosmopolitanness? This is related to another question. Dr. Singer brought up sort of xenophobia and the kind of a backlash to immigrants. I'm wondering if there's a difference between cities that experience an influx of a number of immigrant groups versus cities that just say have one primarily immigrant group.
Okay. On the second question, I hesitate to answer that because these are three cities which have, and one of the things that Audrey's work has shown is Washington, what is it, the world in the zip code. And these are all three cities which have multiple migration streams, even though in Kyiv, probably Kyiv is closer to having a dominant group than the Afghans, but the Afghan community is divided. So I don't know that I have that comparison. But what is the process? The process is very much the one that Dominique summarized. You have the presence of people who are making demands on the system. They're making either political demands or demands for services, or just by their presence, they're changing demands for transportation, for health care, for schooling. And the system at some point ends up having to respond to those demands. Now, in a democratic system, what you get is what Dominique described in Montreal, where there's political capital to be gained by politicians in responding. And that's the process that I was talking about you don't need tolerance to have a tolerant city. You need the mechanism to reward tolerant behavior. And that's exactly the model. It's in Washington, it's a little bit more complicated, but I think you can make a case in terms of demands on public administration in the District of Columbia, or in terms of demands for services in a place like Arlington County, that it's that process. And one of the issues in a place like Herndon is the proportions haven't changed enough, so it's in somebody's political interest to sort of be more embracing. But it's very much, I think, that structure of rewards that is important. And interestingly, I think there's an example in Kyiv that makes the case. About 6 weeks ago, we were approached by a deputy in the Supreme Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, who is switching parties and running in March on a different party from the one he ran on before. And he happens to represent Tryashina. And his issue is going to be the Paris riots. But not the Paris riots as, my God, we have to keep people out. The Paris riots and what can we in Ukraine do to make ourselves an immigrant welcoming society. And because of this contact, we're working with colleagues, and we're probably going to do surveys in 4 Ukrainian cities of immigrant communities. And what has basically happened is that the pressure, because there's no real Ukrainian public policy on this, it falls to local institutions, literally local schools and local hospitals and local politicians like this. And they see opportunities to make careers for themselves. And I think it's that cynical mechanism that creates it. In all of these places, there's clearly xenophobia as well. And I think but what you have to do is change the reward structure so that it's this kind of, that's the creation of diversity capital, is that reward structure.
Joe Brindley, and then the gentleman in the maroon sweater.
I want to add my thanks for your presentation, Blair. I thought it was really a great presentation of the themes in your book. My question really you probably already answered, because I wanted to ask specifically about the importance of electoral politics in this process. And it seems to me that on the basis of your own work, it's not necessary, and particularly if you go back to the cities you studied in Second Metropolis, 19th century Moscow, Osaka, it's not necessary to have this dynamic for absorbing things. And I was also being reminded of Suds Terkel's comment on politics in the Hyde Park neighborhood in Chicago, that it's the place where blacks and whites finally came together in order to keep out the poor. And I think we can see a little bit of that in some of the politics around Washington. But anyway, thank you for your presentation.
I think electoral politics, there the connection, as we heard from Dominique, is direct and is understandable. But I think that there are rewards for politicians, even in non-electoral systems, and their capacity to mobilize resources on their behalf by reaching out to different communities. And I think we've seen a little bit of that in Washington. Moscow's a very different situation, but you see a little bit of that in Moscow too, where it's not about electoral politics, but it's about mobilizing other kinds of resources, and therefore there are incentives to reach out. So I think it's much more visible and transparent in electoral systems. Politicians want votes. But it's, going back to the previous book, I think it has to do with conceptions of how you keep the community together and allow economic growth, or allow your buddies to keep milking the system for themselves or whatever.
Gentleman here.
Sri Gudela, Ukrainian Service of Radio Free of Radio Liberty. Dr. Rubble, you mentioned that Kyiv has become less post-Soviet in terms of its ethnic composition. My question to you is whether it still is a Soviet city in terms of the attitudes that people have towards immigrants. And we know that in the Soviet times, behind the veil of internationalism, there was a widespread racism and xenophobia on the regular level, on the level of the regular people on the streets. And every time I go back to Lviv or Kyiv, I'm astonished to see the amount of finger pointing that still exists when people see on the streets blacks or Asians, for example. So from your field research that you did, from the interviews you did, how comfortable do these people, immigrants, feel in Kyiv? Do they think they have the same opportunities in terms of growth and job opportunities that that Ukrainians have in Kyiv? And the second question related to government policies. From the experience of Montreal and Washington, D.C., what government policies would you recommend the municipal, for example, authorities in Kyiv to pursue, first of all, to promote ethnic, multicultural tolerance in the city?
Well, I think, and I'll try to be quick about this, I think the problem in Ukraine is largely the problem of politicians, but really journalists. Journalists who have written about this subject in Ukraine have been very sensationalist. And what's interesting is when we did the polls among native-born Kyivans and among the immigrants themselves, it turns out to be a much more tolerant picture than you would think reading Ukrainian newspapers. And Mykola Shulga has written extensive study of the way in which Ukrainian journalists write about this subject. The African community is very embittered and speaks of racism and wants out. And there is a clear, the status of Africans in Kyiv is clearly different from the other groups that we're talking about. One of the things we discovered is the groups are different. Kurds have no place else to go. The president of the Kurdish Association of Kyiv is talking to me about how we want land reform so we can go out and buy land and farm. What our findings were with the immigrants themselves, and you can look at the data, largely felt that they were in a tolerant situation. They felt that they were well received by the people they met on the streets. And like everyone in Kyiv, they hate the police. and that comes out in all the surveys that we did. But in terms of, I actually think part of it has to do with an innate politeness that exists for a variety of reasons in Kyiv that I think is a little bit unusual. That there's a surface politeness in normal day discourse that kind of lifts people above giving insults they might give in other places in the world. But if you look at the responses of our immigrants, either in the more complete form on the website or in my book, the immigrants themselves are very happy. And the proof of that is the dramatic increase in the number of people who are becoming Ukrainian citizens. This is a really dramatic story. And it is, being an Afghan with a Ukrainian passport is being an Afghan without any passport. And so for the Afghan community, for the Kurdish community, for the small Vietnamese community, they describe an environment that is much more tolerant than I would have predicted before we did the surveys. For the African community, there's clearly a real problem. In terms of government policy, I think the main recommendation is to get out of denial and recognize this is the future of Ukraine, and then to start thinking about how you're going to use the school system and the healthcare system and so on and so forth to integrate people into Ukrainian life so that you don't have the sense of isolation that existed in Europe. There are many ways of doing it, but I think that that's the big recommendation.
I want to acknowledge the presence recently of Nancy Popson, who did some of that survey work in Kyiv with Blair back in 2002. Nancy, good to see you back here. The last question, a very quick question in the back to one of our Kennan Institute scholars. What's her name?
Natalia Lakizasachuk, former scholar here. I'm sorry my question has been asked, but I have another one. I had a question very similar to the previous one. From lessons learned from Montreal and Washington migrative policy, what Kyiv should do to be welcome city, welcome to migrant city, and at the same time don't lose its uniqueness, its uniqueness, national uniqueness and populational uniqueness. I know that as demographer, I know that migration influence very much to demographic structure, cultural structure, labor structure, religion structure. Even during the Soviet period when we did not have international migration, the face of Kyiv, demographic face of Kyiv has been changed by rural migrants, and Troyeshchina region, you talked about widely, it was formed by rural migrants to Kyiv. And now we have migrants international with different even religion background, cultural, educational, and so on and so on, even language background, they cannot learn Ukrainian language. So how administration of Kyiv should act, don't lose this, the face of Kyiv, real face of Kyiv, and at the same time be a really democratic city and welcome to migrant city. Thank you.
Well, I think part of the story of Montreal and increasingly Washington is this is the new face of Montreal, and at some point in the future it will be the new face of Kyiv. I think the important thing that has to happen in Ukraine, and it is beginning to happen, is that, and it has to happen in Russia too, this has to be recognized as part and parcel of globalization and entering the global world and leaving the isolation of the Soviet Union behind. And it's not only money and capital and oil and gas that flows across borders, it's people who flow across borders. And then I think Ukraine has to do something which it already is a long way on doing, is to define what does it mean to be Ukrainian. And one of the reasons why Kyiv is relatively more user-friendly for, say, the Afghans than Moscow is because of programs and citizenship laws that were set up to accommodate Crimean Tatars, you have the capacity to become a Ukrainian citizen. And what happens this is part of the good part of the story, is it is possible not to be isolated, but to become a Ukrainian citizen, and your kids go to school and they go to university and become integrated in society. I think the lessons that we see in Montreal and Washington and everywhere, and the negative lessons in places like Paris and Birmingham, England, is that you have to recognize that this is what life means in the 21st century. And you have to try to strategically develop policies that allow you to capture the benefits and energy of this process and minimize some of the damage that can be done in terms of loss of face. But as Lieutenant General Moskal said to me when he said there were 400,000 fewer school kids entering first grade yesterday than there were in 1991, and in 50 years, the people who live here are going to be different. It is the face of Ukraine, and there first has to be recognition of that, and then there has to be a discussion of what does that mean, and how can we make it positive and not negative.
30-second comment,
Yes.
if you allow me?
Yes, of course.
On this note, you've all heard the alarmist predictions that Russian population is going to go down the tubes. They're going to lose half of the population. Even the UN agencies are saying that, and etc. It's total denial of the reality that Russia, and Moscow in particular, has become a huge magnet for international migration, and migration of the former Soviet Union, but also international. Much of it is unrecorded. And the same, not at the same scope, but the same phenomenon is happening in Ukraine, because you also have alarmist predictions about demography. The Ukrainian nation is dying, etc. But the more here with the Orange Revolution, the more Ukraine is actually reforming and setting the foundations for economic growth, the more it will become that kind of magnet. Except the face of Ukraine, the face of Russia is changing and will change. That's the reality.
Blair, thank you very much, Dominique. Blair, congratulations. And thank you very much, Dominique and Audrey, for your comments. I appreciate all of you coming and to the Woodrow Wilson Center. And let's continue the celebration across the way with a little good cheer and an opportunity to buy the book. Blair, thank you very much.
Wasn't too bad.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Dominic.